If I say that the world is round and someone else says it's flat, that's worth reporting. But you might also want to report on a bunch of scientific evidence that seems to support the notion that the world is round.
We don't have time for a meeting of the Flat Earth Society. They must have been founding members of the Flat Earth Society. They would not have believed that the world was round.
Yeah, definitely.
So you've mentioned these Masons, Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, Newton, all the way up to Armstrong, Aldrin, and Neil deGrasse Tyson. So, I mean, if they're holding this secret, this would be the biggest secret possible. So are you putting Freemasons at the very top layer of this power pyramid?
No. The Freemasons seem to be the foot soldiers who do all the dirty work, but they're definitely part of a grander scheme involving the Vatican and Jesuits and world royalty and other secret societies. So there's definitely a big network. I don't know. I think people like to kind of debate semantics about the tippy top of the capstone of the pyramid, and I don't know that there even is such a thing, or if we would ever get to it from the outside. But I think it's definitely, world royalty, the Vatican, the Freemasons, and the whole secret society network of, Bohemian Grove and Skull and Bones and all these other organizations. They're all interlinked in some ways through the whole corporate, banking, military, industrial structure. The thing's pretty well interwoven. Every country is a tax farm. There's nowhere on earth you can go to get away from paying taxes and obeying government laws, right? So, they make it sound like America and Russia are sworn enemies, or North Korea or Iran or whatever. They're always giving us boogeymen, but the real boogeymen are all the governments and the people who work for governments. They're all mafia organizations in the sense that they couldn't exist and wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the violence and coercion they use to steal tax money from their populations. Whether it's a democracy, socialism, communism, fascism, every ism involves taxation, forced stealing money from the population to fund the bureaucracy that continues stealing money and writing laws and imprisoning the population, and then making more money off of imprisoning the population, as they do in America with the private prisons, and profiting off the inmates' labor and whatnot. So they've got a big profit margin going here for this scheme, and it's really well interconnected. And to debate about the tippy top all the time, as many conspiracists like to do, I think it's more important to just see that this is a huge network, and it encapsulates literally everything that the conspiracy encyclopedia, has.
Yeah. Great points, man. I don't think anyone would disagree with that here. You talked about Antarctica, of course, being, and people going there and getting turned away at gunpoint. But what about, say, the early explorers? Do we get any indication that the composition is the way you've described from the early explorers who tried to get down there or tried to sail around Antarctica or anything like that?
Yeah, the early sailors that went to the Antarctic, like James Clark and Captain Cook, they spent years trying to find an inlet into the Antarctic ice. On the Ball model, it's supposed to be only about 12,000 miles around the Antarctic ice continent, but on the flat Earth map, it would be much bigger than that. And in reality, when you sail around it, as I said, it takes 3 or 4 years, and they weren't going in a straight line, but they were chartering 50 or 60,000 miles around as they were trying to find an inlet into the ice wall, never able to find one.
Yeah, and you also have, and this is another quote that I pulled off your site, a guy named William Carpenter. He says, "Yes, but we can circumnavigate the South easily enough," is often said by those who don't know. The British ship Challenger recently completed the circuit of the southern region indirectly, to be sure, but she was 3 years about it and traversed nearly 69,000 miles, a stretch long enough to have taken her 6 times around the globular hypothesis. Which is interesting because you can then visualize someone trying to get around this island they have in their head, this big island of ice, this big continent of ice, this idea they have in their head, and they're trying to get around it by just going the same direction. And if you picture it in the flat Earth model, you can visualize how they would just be bumping into the edge all the way around until they got back to kind of their starting point, and then they'd go back up north and be like where they were. And to them, they think they went around a big continent, but they did exactly the opposite and went on the inside of a giant edge. And I thought that quote was pretty interesting.
Yeah, another thing those early explorers found is that they were always outside of their reckoning every day as far as how far they should have traveled on their maps. So they were an average of 12 to 16 miles, sometimes as much as 29 miles out of reckoning. Lieutenant Charles Wilkes, commander of the United States Navy exploration expedition to the Antarctic in 1838, spent almost 4 years going around, and he was writing in his journal how every day he was sometimes up to 20 miles in less than 18 hours out of reckoning. And so they always have to chalk it up to water currents or some sort of thing like this, but they're consistently out of their reckoning because the flat Earth, of course, is much bigger in the southern so-called hemisphere than the ball Earth would be. So the maps that they're using are all assuming the ball Earth. They're flat maps, by the way. They use, it's called plane sailing, is the most common used navigation method, which is done assuming the water is a plane, as it actually is. The natural physics of water proves that all the surface of water on Earth is a plane, by the way, because, as you know, water will always find and maintain its own level. So if it's dammed up and then released, it will rapidly rush off in all directions until it remains level. Yet they say that we're on a big ball here, and the oceans are all convex, somehow held on to the Earth through the magical force of gravity, yet we can see with our eyes, and we know through physics, that water maintains and always is level.
Yeah, that's a compelling point. And you did bring up earlier that the horizon always looks flat, and I think most people would say, well, that's a perspective issue. That would be the argument, the typical argument. But if you haven't seen it, people should look at it. That you're right about the idea that there's people who have attached cameras to balloons, just independent people who've attached a high-def camera to a balloon, sent it up as high as they possibly could just to get that footage, because it is interesting to do. And you are right, as far high as it goes on any of these videos that I've seen, I'm a little surprised that you never see a curvature. Even thousands of feet up, you don't see that curvature. It's a little odd. You'd expect to see it.
Yeah, though sometimes you do see curvature, and it's because of using a wide-angle lens.
Right.
For instance, on the Red Bull dives that Felix Baumgartner did that everybody has seen, if you notice, the outside cameras are clearly wide-angle lens, and then there's an inside cockpit camera that isn't. And as you're watching it from the outside cameras, you'll notice that the supposed curvature of the ball Earth starts really early on, just as he's lifting off. And the exact same curvature stays exactly the same all the way up to the point where he's going to jump. So the curve is the same, but his altitude has risen by many, many miles. The reason the curve is the same, of course, is because it's a wide-angle lens effect. It's not actually the curve of the horizon. It just seems that way.
Right.
And that's proven by the inside camera, which, as the door opens, you can see the horizon out that inside camera. It has risen to the eye of the camera. As I said, on a ball Earth, you wouldn't open that camera and have the horizon right at eye level in front of you, no matter how big the ball was. That effect can only happen on a flat plane, and you can see in that dive shot that the inside camera, the horizon is completely flat. Mm-hmm. Then it goes to the outside, and you got a huge curve. But when you're looking at some of the amateur balloon footage, some of it's lens corrected, and it's completely flat. And others, like the GoPro stuff, the horizon will fluctuate as the camera spins and tilts. The horizon will go convex and concave, but whenever it's still, it will level off at completely level. And you can see that the convex and concave the images are just a lens effect. It's obviously not the horizon shifting every 2 seconds as the camera jumps.
Yeah.
And when it's still, you can see all the way up, totally flat.
Yeah, I have a GoPro, so I'm very familiar with that fisheye lens, which, yeah, that's not going to be reliable for what we're trying to look at. And another thing about that guy who does the jump from the upper atmosphere, when he lands, he does a Masonic hand symbol. So he very well could just be another pawn in the game to create the illusion. I thought that was pretty interesting. Let's see. Another big issue that people are going to have is we're told we have tens of thousands of satellites orbiting the Earth for GPS systems, cell phones, military radar, navigational equipment. How do we rectify that?
Yeah. Well, and they also say that there's an International Space Station out there, and there's a Hubble telescope floating out there taking wonderful CGI Photoshop pictures that they send us back with their amazing 400-mile outer space internet connection to the Hubble Space Telescope. And now the internet space connection has gone to over 1 million miles with the new Rosetta mission. Have you seen that one? Mm-hmm. The CGI Photoshop pictures from that are just wonderful and well worth the billions of dollars we're spending to get them. Yeah, so the illusion is that there's a space station and satellites and telescopes just floating out there in infinite space. But you and I know that no matter how high you go, you come right back down. Whatever goes up must come down. The illusion is that at some point, if you go high enough, this gravity they claim exists that pulls you back down to the Earth, suddenly just you pop out of it and into the vacuum of space. Now, the vacuum of space can't exist because it's connected to the non-vacuum of the atmosphere in Earth and all the other supposed planets that exist. So a vacuum must be a closed system, but they claim space is a vacuum and space is an open system. So it's philosophically impossible for space to be a vacuum. And the way that they fool us into thinking that this actually is plausible is threefold. First way they do it is in zero-G planes, which are Boeing 737s that do parabolic maneuvers that have a free-fall illusion, free-fall effect rather, that happens for about a minute, where you can be floating in these planes. And that's how they get this outer space look, like you're floating in outer space. The second way is through wires, harnesses, and green screen for the longer shots. In the ISS, for instance, they do that. And the third way, for like the outside shots they do, are in pools. They're actually underwater. And this is confirmed by the fact that there's bubbles rising in the pool in a lot of their shots. And people on YouTube have dissected a lot of the ISS and other supposed space footage and all the space bubbles that are coming out of their helmets. Some people are even wearing scuba gear. They found that as well. So that they fake these zero-G illusions by being in water, by being in zero-G planes, and by being in harnesses in front of a green screen. And that makes us think that it's possible that out there in space you could just be kind of floating around like they show us in the movies. But as far as we'll ever know, as far as you or I would ever know, we go as high as we can in a plane or a balloon or a rocket, and we come right back down. Even the rockets they send up, if you're honest about it, you'll notice that they don't go straight up. All their rockets start a parabolic curve, they start to arc over, and the ones they claim are successful are the ones that go out of view before they come all the way back down. And if anybody asks, why do they always curve over like that? They just say that they're going around the curvature of the ball Earth, and they'll reach escape velocity soon. And at some point, they'll just pop right out of the gravity, and then they'll be floating, which is another problem, because if you were in a vacuum and you were using rocket thrusters or anything to thrust yourself forward, you wouldn't go forward or in any direction you wanted to. You just spin wildly out of control like a gyroscope in 360 degrees in 3 dimensions, spinning wildly. You don't go anywhere that way. So the whole idea of space travel is a big joke. It's all science fiction.
Yeah, the other thing I thought was really compelling about the satellites is you talk about just go on Google and do an image search for satellites. A lot of the stuff you see is going to look pretty archaic considering modern technology because they've been using the same model for so long. But almost everything, well, if this model is to be true, it'd have to be everything, but everything you see looks CGI, or it looks like a little computer graphic of a satellite. Where are the pictures of Earth with 20,000 satellites orbiting it? If we have an International Space Station, can't you get a photograph that has all these little dots that should look like lice all around the Earth's outer atmosphere? That's one issue, but also the temperature. They tell us the thermosphere is 2,000 degrees Celsius. Well, what metal is going to be able to withstand that kind of heat? What computer can survive in that environment?
Yeah, that's right. Those are two more good points for why satellites, well, we shouldn't just assume that these things exist just because people say they do. If you want to be scientific and you want to be a real skeptic, you want to be a critical thinker, then you should only accept things that you can verify with your senses and with evidence yourself. So, people think it's crazy to believe that satellites don't exist. But really, it's crazy to believe that satellites do exist when you have no evidence and can never verify it for yourself. Just like these space programs and space telescopes and all these other things that we will never confirm. As far as we know, if I go up on a plane and I jump out, I'm coming back to Earth. Doesn't matter how high I go. I'm not going to start floating at some point like they claim happens, and has to happen if there are satellites out there. But as you said, if you look at the pictures of satellites and the pictures that these satellites are supposedly taking, they're all CGI. The satellite itself is fake. The pictures of the Earth look like cartoons. They claim almost all of them are composites, which is their word. They say that they receive ribbons of imagery from satellites, which is their term they use to tell us, why we don't just get a friggin' photograph. So they say we get ribbons of imagery, and then they have to splice the ribbons of imagery together in Photoshop. So they even admit, NASA workers themselves have admitted that they have to use Photoshop on the satellite images. It's just how the data is received, and so, that's how it is, man. Yeah.
NASA's Rob Simon made this. Simon's job is...
It's primarily taking data and making pictures out of it.
That's what this is, a composite of data sets from several different instruments translated into a picture.
So we actually had to take clouds out.
They stashed the clouds for later, went onto the ocean. That came from an instrument that measures phytoplankton in the sea.
Where it was low, I colored it dark blue because they're low mostly in mid-oceans. And then where it was a little bit higher, it was like a little bit brighter green.
Then add the clouds back in.
There's a small problem with it because there's a very slight gap in between each orbit.
So some of those are painted on.
It is photoshopped, but it's has to be.
Then
there was another layer to sort of simulate the atmosphere.
And then there's this little bright spot.
It's called the specular highlight. So it's the reflection of sunlight off of water.
Those are the pieces, but you can't just slap them all together.
It just didn't look realistic. It looks kind of flat, or the clouds are sort of too see-through. So I just hit Command-Z a lot.
There's artistry to creating the world.
What I imagine it to be. Unfortunately, I'm not an astronaut. I've never been to space. But I've looked at these images over and over again, trying to sort of get the essence of it. It is photoshopped, but it's has to be. It is photoshopped, but it's has to be. It is photoshopped, but it's has to be. It is photoshopped, but it's has to be.
Just broke this dream's reality wide open.